Ruth Wisse was born in 1936 in Chernovich, Romania, to Masha and Leo Roskis. At the age of 4, Ruth fled her native Romania for Canada, and the family settled in Montreal, where Ruth grew up along with her brother Ben. She went on to study literature at McGill, the first stop in a storied academic career that took her from McGill to Columbia, back to McGill, and finally to Harvard, where she taught Yiddish literature for over 20 years. Ruth has published 8 books, including most recently her memoir, Free as a Jew, which we'll be discussing today. She's also the winner of a lot of prizes and awards, among them the Itzhak Menger Prize for Yiddish Literature and a National Humanities Medal. None of the details, though, in Ruth Wisse's biography can capture her importance and her impact. Her importance and impact on the academy, on America's political and intellectual life, and perhaps most importantly, her impact on the Jewish people. Ahead of sitting down today with Ruth, I reached out to several of her former students and mentees, and I asked them to tell me some stories about her. And the word that came up most often when I spoke to them was one word, and that's the word hero, which potentially she will balk at, but that was indeed the word. How has a woman of such small physical stature,
thank you,
you're welcome, loomed like a giant in the lives of so many people that I admire? What is it about her worldview that has inspired profound intellectual opposition from her enemies, but also deep gratitude, even among her students who don't see the world in precisely the same way? That's among the many things that I want to discuss in the time that I have with you today. And Ruth, thank you so much for being here.
Oh my God, it's really a pleasure, Bari. Pleasure sitting with you.
So hero, you don't love that word, as you told me before we sat down. Why is that?
No, I don't, for a number of reasons. One is because of what I would reserve it for. I've known heroes in my life. I grew up on the stories of heroes, and those are people who put their lives at risk under terrible circumstances. Natan Sharansky is a hero in our time. But you know, to be so fortunate as I've been in my life, fortunate to be able to say whatever I want, to think as I please, and as far as I can tell, to be rewarded for it, because I've never suffered the consequences of my ideas. The things that haven't come to me I don't know about, and I actually don't care so much about. So in that sense, I don't think the word hero applies to my idea of it. But what really bothers me more about it is, look, I'm extremely grateful for the respect that that word carries. And I would have wanted to have the affection and respect of my students. And so that's very gratifying. But think of what it means. Have I said anything in my life that's really extraordinary? I say things which seem to me to be self-evident. I don't think I have ever said anything which seems to me to be surprising or particularly original. You know, what I try to do in teaching and in everything is just to call it as it is.
So maybe the word itself is an indictment of our era.
Exactly. Thank you. That's exactly what I mean. And so the fact that they think that it takes heroism to stand up at a faculty meeting and just, you know, say what one thinks is an indictment of what our culture has become and what the society has become, or at least certain parts of it.
Well, in a culture, or you know, in the context where you made your career, the academy, frankly, it's unthinkable that someone with your views right now would even go into the academy, let alone get tenure.
Yes. Well, that's sad, but you see, I had certain advantages. One thing is that I never aspired to be a professor at Harvard. So if I hadn't become a professor at Harvard, it wouldn't have meant all that much to me. And a part of the tragedy of it is also this, that you see, when I came, let's say, to Harvard, or when one is a professor at a university, one of the things that you're afraid of is losing the respect of your colleagues. I'm not the only one in this position. You grow up that way. What if I say something that reveals that I haven't read X, or that I got this wrong, and so forth? Okay, so that's your fear going in. But here's what happened to me during my tenure at Harvard. I lost respect for my colleagues. And that is far more devastating in its own way. I couldn't care what they thought of me. You know, it's almost you get to the point where you want their disrespect. You know,
Wow.
what you have to hold yourself back from courting it, as it were, because you feel that they are, you know, they're so. Mostly it's not the people on the wrong side, but it's mostly the people who won't stand up for anything. And my sympathies go out to them because I know what they want. They just want to be professors. They just want to be scholars. That's why you go into that profession, or that's why many people do. Why bother then standing up for things that you know will get you into trouble? But still, when it's necessary, you expect it. And when they don't, and when they don't support things which are, as I say, self-evident good, then how can you really care what they think about you?
Well, I want to get to that, and I want to get to how we've gotten to a place in which, you know, a woman standing up, as you put it, for common sense would be regarded as a hero, and what that says about our culture. How much the world has changed. But before we get there, let's go back to the beginning.
Okay.
Let's go back to the world you were born into, which is so very different from the world that we currently inhabit. Take me back, if you would, to Romania in the mid-1930s. Tell me about the world that you were born into, and tell me a little bit about your parents.
Well, the world that I was born into actually was much more horrifying than the world that we're in. And my parents, at least my father, understood exactly how bad it was. That was his major strength. My parents had
I assume he wasn't a college professor. What did he do?
No, he was not. My father had studied chemical engineering in Vilna. And at that point, he was a very poor boy because his parents did not support this position at all. So he had come to Vilna on his own. He had, you know, educated himself on his own. He slept on straw. He gave lessons to young girls at the university in order to, you know, get enough money for his for food and lodging. And he got a degree, a master's degree in chemical engineering. As a matter of fact, we now have a copy of the dissertation that he wrote.
Wow.
Yes, it's quite extraordinary what you can now get access to. So there he was, and my mother was an orphan by the time she was under 20. But also, you know, from a pretty well-to-do family. So my parents were both from cultivated families and so on. They didn't see themselves as very poor kids. And the image that I grew up with of Vilna in the 1920s was youth. That was a magical time. Every time they spoke about it, they started singing the songs that they would sing in their groups. It was an amazing time for them, even though it was partly because anti-Semitism in Poland was becoming so strong that the Jews had no option but to pull back into their own resources. So Yiddish culture and Jewish activities, Jewish youth clubs, they explored the whole countryside of Vilna. That was part. They would go on night hikes to know the ground. There were people among them who actually went out to count the different kinds of plants.
Why? Why?
Well, because it was called Landkenntnis, and it was part of, it was akin to the Zionist movement.
I was going to say, that's what it sounds like.
Well, it is. So, but this was their territory, you see. So yes, many of them were Zionists. And they also, my father wanted to study agriculture so that he could go to settle in Palestine. But they didn't allow Jews into agriculture, which is how he ended up in chemistry, right? And so this is just to say that they come from a very spirited, youthful thing, but totally penniless. Then my father, when he graduates, gets hired as a chemical engineer in the rubber industry. And to cut a very long and interesting story a little shorter, he gets sent to Romania, to Czernowitz, as you say, to build the first rubber factory in northern Romania. He is then barely 30 years old. And he does this. The factory's called Kaurom. It exists to this day.
Wow.
It employed hundreds of people. It produced rubber goods of all kinds. It was a very, very successful factory. My parents were catapulted into wealth, right? They had fantastic resources. My father had a chauffeur who would take him. Yes, well, this is it. You see, he had been, for a very brief time, attracted to communism, then got unattracted, got disillusioned, and so when he came to Czernowitz, he had all this behind him, but he loved that work. He loved building that factory. So there they were, in a society of young engineers and of young lawyers, young professionals, a very Jewish society, because Czernowitz at that time was also multicultural, but the ethnic communities were not very in close contact with one another. So the Jews, again, were pushed back onto their own resources. And my parents belonged to a club called Masada, which was a Zionist club that functioned in German. And that was a very happy time for the most part.
So they have this kind of, as you're describing it, idyllic experience in Vilna, counting the grass and making it feel like this is their home. And then they're in Romania and they have a chauffeur. Sounds like they're living a very good life. What did your father see? How did he see it?
Well,
because your family leaves Romania in 1940.
Yes.
Well ahead of, a lot of the horrors that were to come. What did he see?
Well, quite specifically, there are layers of complication that I try to lay out a little bit in the memoir. But basically what my father knew was that the threat from Stalin was more immediate than the threat from Hitler in Romania. And so he knew someone who was on the northern border of Romania, and he asked that gentleman, if the Russians cross the border, you call immediately. But by that time, my father was already in Bucharest, arranging for us to leave if we could, getting us exit visas if we could. And my mother got the call, and within a few hours, we were on the train to Bucharest. So you see, yes, they left in a hurry, but they were prepared to abandon things because they knew when the time came to leave, you just had to leave. And I owe my life to them.
When I look back at the kind of years of your life, like what you've lived through, early in your childhood, really, you have lived through really one of the most transformative periods of Jewish history.
Yes.
The Holocaust, the Shoah, obviously. But then, when you were 12 years old, 1948, May 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel.
Right.
You're 12. What do you remember, if you do remember, of that day? Did you understand the enormity of the moment?
Oh, did we ever? Of course we did. I mean, that day, in a way, I don't remember it so acutely, but, one would say that if you had to say what was the happiest day of your life, aside from giving birth to the children and other things of that kind, personal things, of course that was the happiest day of our life. That and the 29th of November, when miraculously, the resolution was passed at the United Nations partitioning Palestine. Well, we thought that was the beginning of a new phase of Jewish history. How could we think otherwise?
Well, it was.
It was, exactly. Yes and no, though. It wasn't because of the partition that the Jews won Palestine. It's almost despite, but at least it was at that point, sanctified. But you see, in relation to what you're saying, I also grew up thinking that nothing that was happening to us was of any historical importance. You see, it never occurred to me that I would be sitting here one day talking about my life. How could it be? What does it mean to be in Canada? Everything was happening elsewhere. Obviously in Europe, our ears were always attuned to what was happening in Europe. Who was saved? Who was killed? what was going on. And then the rise of the State of Israel. So you always lived knowing that they were making history.
I'm living through a miracle of Jewish history, truly. And that is where the Jewish future is going to play out. And yet you decide to study Yiddish literature, not Hebrew, Yiddish, the language, in my view, of the Jewish past. Why? Why Yiddish? Why were you drawn to that field?
Well, it's complicated. But that is not how we perceived Yiddish in our home.
Right. How did you
Yes.
perceive it?
Well, you see, my mother, when we came to Canada, my father's family, my father's brothers were already there, and they all lived in the toniest part of Montreal, the area called Westmount, or into Westmount. That's the western side of the mountain, so to speak. Well, after 1 year of that, my mother moved us. And so I sometimes say, we are the only deliberately downwardly mobile family that I know. My mother moved us not into poverty. I want to make that very clear. My mother was not interested in lowering our standard of living, but she wanted to live near the Yiddish-speaking Jews because her whole life was invested in that Yiddish culture. As I was saying about Vilna, you see, that was their life. And so the home in which I grew up was extraordinarily vital. The school that I went to was a labor Zionist school, which was devoted to the State of Israel. The principal's son was already living in a kibbutz in the State of Israel. So Israel was very much in Yiddish and in Hebrew. There was no such division as seems to have developed for a variety of, after that, yes. And because of political reasons, the politicization of Yiddish on the one hand, and then the need in Israel to get rid of Yiddish because they were so intent on consolidating the country around one language, as they would have had to do. So all that developed after the fact. But Yiddish to me was the language of Zionism, and it's never been otherwise.
Ruth, how did you meet your husband?
I met my husband under ideal circumstances.
So Tinder.
I was, yes. I was working at the McGill Daily.
Yeah.
And the sports editor of the McGill Daily asked me one day, how would you like a job at summer camp? And I said, I have a job at summer camp, because that's all I'd ever done in the summer times, is go to, and I'd graduated to being a counselor. He said, no, this is a boys' camp. My eyes lit up. The dream of my life. What? He said, well, these owners of this camp have a little girl, and they want to open one group of a few girls for this camp. Would you like that job? And I said, oh my God, of course. So I went to interview, and the director of the camp is a wonderful man, Jules Levitt, said to me, you're hired. He said, but I would like to ask you just one thing. You can go out with all the guys in the camp, but you see, there's an esprit, there's a boys, it's a boys' camp. I don't want you to ruin that by going out with one person.
So go out with all of them.
Yes, you can go out with all of them. You can be buddies with all of them, whatever you like. But you see, don't break up that group thing. I said, moi? What would I be doing going out with? Well, of course, the one thing I wanted at that point, I was 18. I knew I had to get married.
Why? Why did you tell me?
You were not in Montreal.
I wasn't.
During the night. No, clearly not. But by 18, I really...
You were an old maid by 18?
I was an old maid. First of my friends were getting married. And it was in college. And if you didn't get married in college, then what were you going to do? So I knew I would go to work, right? But how would I get out of my parents' house? Mm-hmm. That was the question. The way you got out of your parents' house was to enter your own house. And you entered your own house by making your own family. And it was understood. So anyway, at the first counselors' meeting, the little girl that I was going to be the counselor of was standing at the door, and I thought she was waiting for me. She wasn't waiting for me. I said, are you coming in? She said, no, I'm waiting for Lenny. And I said, really? And then Lenny showed up. And I saw this guy, and I thought, okay, he's the one.
Talk to me, if you would, beyond your personal experience of Aliyah and then coming back to North America, the tension that I think a lot of serious Zionist diasporic Jews feel, which is this tension between wanting to be a part of the great theater of the main stage, really, of Jewish history at this period of time, but also feeling like maybe you can make a bigger impact here than there in a personal way.
Well, this is two things interesting about your question. One is that it's Amos Oz who actually came and gave talks like that, saying, we are the main stage. Whatever you think, he would come to Montreal and to American Jewry.
Do you agree with that?
Well, of course. I mean, yes. I mean, Israel is the center of Jewish life. Always has been, even when Jews were not inhabiting it and were not sovereign in the country. The land of Israel was always the center of Jewish life. Jerusalem, we know, is the center of Jewish life. There is no other. And as North American Jews, I would say that we will be judged historically by only one thing. Did you or did you not secure the state of Israel? So it's for them to do physically, but I think it's our task just as much. I think that's the only question we will be asked.
Really?
Yes. Because who cares, basically? Yes, I'm devoted to, I'm devoted to teaching Jewish culture. I'm so proud of what has been accomplished. I believe in Jewish institutions here. I think they should flourish. I think that all Jews who participate in synagogue and in whatever activities that are wholesome and healthy in American Jewish life, it's wonderful. But really, I ask you at this, looking at it from God's point of view and from the trajectory of Jewish history, do you really think that it makes a great deal of difference, what happens in American Jewry as compared to what happens to the future of Israel?
There was something that a Harvard student of yours put to me when I asked him about you. This is what he said. Talk about being willing to stand alone. She was the single solitary member of the Harvard faculty that stood against Oslo, as just one example. That was an unbelievably unpopular position on campus. And then when the huge wave of Hamas terrorism took place in the late 1990s, Ruth was the only person that we could turn to for support. Students at Harvard that I spoke to really perceived you as sort of being a one-woman army alone on the field. Did you feel lonely in that way?
Well, lonely, no, because first of all, there was Harvey Mansfield, who was always...
And your 8 friends.
My 8 friends, exactly. And there are really strong professors, but yes, they did not want to, I don't know why. I never felt, no, you see, first of all, if students are your friends, how can you be lonely? As I say, I would much rather have had them to speak to than, about these things, many of my colleagues. But I always say my proudest moment in that regard is when a group of young women came to me one day, and my office was quite off campus, so you had to trek in order to get to there.
Was there any messaging in that from the university, or was just that
No,
that's
where the Jewish Studies department was located. No, it was a very comfortable place to be, but no. It may have been messaging originally, but not as far as I was concerned. They wanted to form a club of Opus Dei, and they wanted me to be their advisor.
Okay, so let's just, Opus Dei meaning
my pride, the right
Catholic
wing of the Catholic Church, yes. They wanted to found a chapter of the right wing of the Catholic Church because their strongest...
So what does that tell you, though? They wanted Ruth Wisse,
yes, exactly.
Jew, refugee from Eastern Europe, professor of Yiddish literature, to be their advisor.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So that's how you've perceived that you must be the only one, because why in the world would they come to you?
Did you agree?
Well...
Are you a member of Opus Dei right now?
Really? No, as a matter of fact, the first thing I said to them was, look, I know what your biggest issue is. Your biggest issue is abortion. That's what drove them to this. They were passionate about the death of the child. I mean, they really felt it from the inside. I said, it's not just that I'm not even a Christian. I'm not certainly not a Catholic, but I'm not a Christian. I said, but I would be no good for you because I don't feel that way about abortion. I mean, I really dislike abortion, and I really do think I feel very differently than my body, my choice. But I wouldn't go to the mat on the issue of abortion. They said they don't care because I would go to the mat for them being a group. And that was certainly true. That was certainly true. But anyway, so I came home in my usual way to talk about megalomania, and I was a little bit happy with this. And I told my daughter, Abby, about this. And there was a pause, and she said, you know, Mom, it's wonderful when you stand up for things that you believe in. But I think it's a little bit less wonderful if you have to stand up for things that you don't quite believe in. So I went back to them and I said, listen, I'm sure we can find somebody who will be your advisor.
And did they?
Yes, I think they did.
Harvey Mansfield, the only other one?
Well, Harvey was the other guy, yes. Harvey they had, but they also found someone else. But it does tell you how extreme Harvard had become. Right? It's worth telling the story because it's not about me so much.
Of course
it's just
not.
about it's about the atmosphere.
Well, let's go in a little more deeply to your politics and your worldview. You know, in America, of course, it's not just the perception, it's the reality that Jews are politically left of center, right? So just a simple question to start off. Why? Why are Jews liberal?
Well, Judaism has a strong liberal element within it, but why Jews are liberal, I mean, there's a lot been written on this. That's not your real question.
What is my real question?
Well, I mean, maybe your real question, I shouldn't put, your real question is, why are Jews anti-Jewish when they become liberal? In other words, what happened to liberalism that made it seem so different from, how did it become an alternative to Judaism?
I think there are two questions. I think one question is, why are Jews drawn to liberalism?
Okay.
Historically, why that makes sense in this country. And then I think the additional question is, how did progressivism come to replace Judaism in the lives of many American Jews?
Right, exactly. So why are Jews liberal? Well, there's a strong liberal tradition in Judaism. And it depends what you mean by the word liberal. I mean, we were all liberals. George Eliot is my all-time favorite writer, right? I mean, the greatest mind that I know in literature. She was fighting to save liberalism, as I understand her writing, in this very complex way, exactly the complex way in which the Talmud tries to do that, and the complex way, by the way, in which America tries to define itself as a liberal democracy, right? The Republic is basically liberal tending, okay? So all of that is a very healthful part. The question is, what happens when liberalism becomes, we say, illiberal? And what happens when it becomes regressive? You see, I don't buy the word progressive. And I say that if you really want to understand what is going on, just substitute regressive for progressive. And here's what I mean. America is the most advanced society politically. It has the most unbelievably complicated, wonderful system of government and so forth. That was progress.
Right, but the civil rights movement, let's just say, was progress. That wasn't regress.
No, that was progress, but you see, this is what Martin Luther King called it, a second emancipation. I mean, he was perfecting America. He knew that it had not yet reached its own level of, the words and the music were not in sync with one another. That the laws were there, but it had not yet become what it was supposed to become. He brought it to its full potential, or the civil rights movement did, in that very important sense. It took no time for the left to completely disfigure that. And that's what happened at the university. The most awful thing is to introduce group preferences. It said everyone was to be considered an individual, irrespective of all those categories. Comes the university, and within a very short period of time, what it does is it says, oh no, we're only dealing in categories. with the disadvantaged categories of women and of African Americans and of any other people that we can, and the disabilities and all the rest of it. Every group, you see, that could be identified as a grievance group or as a group which was disadvantaged. I'm not saying that many of these groups really had not suffered handicap, but the idea was to make them able to compete honestly and energetically within the marketplace of ideas and within a structure, not to change the structure. So this is what the university did, but here's to me the tragedy of it. It never admitted to itself that this is what it was doing. It said affirmative action, and it never admitted, it was never prepared to say that in emphasizing this one thing, it was absolutely undermining what the civil rights movement had achieved. There's an enormity to that. And it did the same thing with meritocracy. I mean, it used to be understood that at an advanced level of learning, you know, the university, and a university that considers itself one of the finest in the world, right? Of course you come in because of merit. And of course professors have to be chosen on that basis, right? What other basis? They have to be the best in their field or pretend to be the best in their field. Well, you know, this is admission, right? No, but it's not just that they started admitting people who would not have been admitted on a strictly even basis, but they never said to themselves that we are substituting one value for another.
Do you think if you had been a man with your political worldview that you would have gotten tenure at a place like Harvard? Do you think that being a woman had something to do with it?
Oh, at that point?
Yeah.
Of course, because in one of my departments, they would never have hired me. First of all, they would never have hired me if they had really done their homework and knew whom they were hiring. But you know, they don't dig deep. But they couldn't not hire me because I was a woman. See, because there were a lot of feminists there already, like, you know, activist feminists. So the fact that I was a woman really in that department, I mean, both departments in a way worked for me.
You mentioned feminists and you mentioned feminist activists, and you have a little glint in your eye, so I think I understand how you feel about that word. What's strange to me, or maybe paradoxical, is to me, I feel like I'm sitting across from the fruit of the feminist movement. Feminism made your life possible. And yet, as you write in your book, politicized feminism is a form of Bolshevism. What do you mean by that? And can you explain to me where you think feminism went wrong?
Sure. Well, unfortunately, I'm not skilled at all those phases of feminism, which have already been written about. So there's this phase and that phase.
The waves.
The waves. But what I'm talking about is women's lib. Obviously, the suffragette movement and the movement for women's
equality.
Equality before the law, certainly, and equality of opportunity.
That's feminism, though.
No. Well, that was feminism, yes. First phase or whatever it is, feminism. Of course I'm a feminist of that nature, but I don't call it feminism. I call it America. I mean, as it evolved. Look, you can't hold the past responsible for its errors and failures. You can learn from them, and America, of all countries, learned from it. I mean, look at how quickly it evolved, and look at how quickly it was ready to really credit women. As soon as they wanted what they wanted and were ready to stand up for it, it happened. And it happened very quickly, in historical terms, very quickly. So, of course, I am for that. As a matter of fact, you know, in Quebec law, for example, I wrote letters to the government sometimes when I felt that women were not equal before the law and so forth.
So you're a feminist activist, in my view.
And if that's what it means to you, but that's not women's lib. Come on. What they mean is Betty Friedan, and it came from Marxism. She took the language of the economics, class conflict, everything is politics, and she transformed it into gender. And that was why I say it's Marxism, you see. If you look at it, everything is conflict between, first of all, class conflict is in itself an absurd construct.
Okay, we need another 2 hours
another
for that.
Another 2 hours for that. Class conflict is in itself a ridiculous concept, really. As you know, if you ever walked into a factory that was living or into a real economic situation, it isn't like that. There are all kinds of adjustments, and everything is not reducible to class by any means. But to then politicize gender as a power play, as having to do with a conflict between genders, that's dangerous. I knew how dangerous that was. I knew how dangerous that was. Forgive me, many people will have to forgive me for this, because I knew how fragile civilization was, and I knew how fragile men were.
Okay, so for people who are hearing you say things like, there's no such thing as class conflict, which I totally disagree with, but we'll leave it for another time, or to suggest that somehow acknowledging power distinctions between men and women is what's at stake in that is civilization itself. Draw that out for us a little bit more.
I will try. Firstly, let me say, it's not that there isn't class differences and class separations. Understand, that exists. Of course, class separations exist. But that there should be class conflict automatically as a result of that? No. There should be cooperation, and there has to be, as there is in any good economic structure. There has to be cooperation, not conflict. And you have to have a system that understands that there will have to be a certain kind of economic inequality in any free and open society. That's the basis of a free and open society. Here's how I saw it. Women had been liberated.
Yes.
That's what we began with. Who had liberated them? Well, medicine, science had
liberated
them. The pill, but not just the pill, not just the pill. We know that on Rosh Hashanah, the time when all Jews who go to the synagogue even one day a year are in the synagogue that day, what is the reading from the Torah that day that the rabbis chose? What the rabbis chose
Hannah.
is Hannah, exactly, from the book of Samuel. The woman
she's infertile and begging to have a child.
Because the greatest tragedy in human life was infertility. It's not the pill regulating negatively. It's that the whole question of fertility had now changed. And more than that, every woman could expect to raise all the children that she bore. That's even more important. You see, if I go back to my grandmothers, every one of my grandmothers lost multiple children to have them as many children as they had. Multiple children. My paternal grandmother lost half of her children before she had the 5 who remained alive. My mother lost a child, you see. So here suddenly women, they can have children if they want to, very late in life even, and they can keep them alive. They can expect to keep them.
Right, you were 18 and an old maid, now 40. I mean, I feel you.
There you go.
But isn't that a good thing?
But so what do you do with a good thing? You don't say, gimme, gimme, gimme. Oh, I'm oppressed. Oh, they're keeping me down. Oh, it's a mystique. No, you add a prayer. Even if you're a secular person, you add a prayer to your life every morning. Thank you.
For not letting me live in a time where I have to die in childbirth, for not living in a time where I have to get pregnant at 16.
Exactly. And yes, and for all that this has given me, choice. So I thank you for the extra levels of freedom and choice that I have been granted as a result of this. I did not win this, right? I've been granted this. So if you do not begin with gratitude, what you get instead is grievance. And that's where I think the crux lies, you see. Do you put the emphasis on gratitude, or do you put the emphasis on grievance? And I think that
I agree with.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. So I don't belong to the grievance part of the feminist movement. I don't think there's anything to be aggrieved about. And we all speak out of our own cultural situation. So I must say, I don't know what it is like to be a Muslim woman in a Muslim household. Phyllis Chesler writes about this and so forth. She does know. So then you fight for women's rights for those women. But in my small world, I think women do not understand enough how much more responsible they have to be. You can't break down all the institutions and want more and more. And it's not a question of control in that way. What you want is love. What you want is the enrichment of life, which is not to define it as a battlefield.
So politicized feminism is a form of Bolshevism. That's one thing that sticks out. Another,
I forget what I've written.
Another controversial opinion, and I think this puts you at odds with many people in the Jewish community, is your opposition to Washington, D.C.'s Holocaust Museum and other similar memorials. Why is that?
Oh, well, that has grown deeper, by the way. It wasn't only, I was opposed to this from the very beginning. I thought the Jewish mourning and commemoration is something that should be done within the Jewish community. If you want to present Jews to the world, use us as an example. You use us as an example of recognizing evil as early as possible and organizing against it as effectively as possible. That's what the Jews are about, if they're going to go public. And the one story that you wanted to tell in 1948 and ever after is of our self-reliance, of the astonishing achievement of the Jews in the same decade that 1/3 of the Jewish people was destroyed in what is now called the Holocaust or the Churban or the Shoah. The Jews reclaimed their sovereignty in the land of Israel that had been under foreign occupation for 2,000 years. I keep saying to people, find me a miracle anywhere, in the Bible, in any text, find me a miracle to compare with that. I don't think in human civilization there's a miracle to agree with that. This people that was 17 million strong to begin with, you lose not just that they're killed, eradicated, but in 5 years, this people that had a reputation for intelligence to be killed like that. So what do you do as a people, the American Jewish community? You go to the world, you build a museum, and you say, come, look at how they killed us. Oh, isn't this a lesson for the ages? Now, that is insanity, truly.
Let's talk a little bit more deeply about your definition and your understanding of what anti-Semitism is. There's a very provocative passage in your book that I want to read to you. You're writing about anti-Semitism, and you say this: "It is meaningless and all too easy to end the discussion about anti-Semitism with sympathetic references to the Jews as canaries in the coal mine, that is, sacrificial signals of a lurking society-wide position. The analytical task," you write, "is to isolate the political variables on the sides of the victims and the perpetrators, and to identify how and why the political behavior of Jews permitted or invited such a pattern of aggression." Now, I read that, and I stopped, and I read it again, and I read it again. And I want to ask you, do you hear how someone could read that and hear you as blaming the Jews for permitting or inviting Jew hatred?
Yes, well, then I did not write carefully enough. If you who are a very good reader could read it 3 times and still wonder about that, then I did not write it carefully enough. And this is a very good instructive moment, because I did write a whole book about this called Jews and Power,
Of course.
where I do try to make these distinctions very carefully. And what I begin with and end with is precisely the attempt to make sure that nobody misunderstands it that way. Because what I try to describe is precisely what we've been talking about. All those wonderful features about the Jewish people that have kept them going and coming back and being able to rebuild and restructure themselves. I mean, it is a wonderful civilization. One would want to be talking from beginning to end positively about what this civilization, contains and what it...
And yet,
you have to ask, I mean, we are the no-fail target of history. I mean, that's what we are, because it's very convenient to attack the Jews. If it were not so convenient to attack the Jews on every campus, do you think anyone would be doing it?
Well, I was speaking to another one of your students who said to me that he remembers one thing about you most clearly. And he said Ruth would always shake her fist and shake it menacingly and say, "This is what the rest of the world does with their fist." And then she would beat her breast and say, "And this is what the Jews do."
Yes.
Is there something in that contains the answer?
Yes, there is. But you see, you can't do sound bites on this, because this same tendency is self-reliance. You see, the same thing that we take on.
And self-improvement and self-criticism.
Exactly. Self-improvement, self-criticism, and self-discipline, right, this is the crux of a good thing. But then, when it comes up against, the question is always, what are you up against? What is your environment? Well, when we were growing up in Canada and so on, we would not be having this discussion. And in those, what I call the period of grace in Jewish history, between 1948 and 1973, right, when Jews were a good liberal cause, we would never be having this discussion, because it wasn't on my mind, because we knew that America was not capable of turning against the Jews. Now, what happened in America? What happened in America is that there are grievance groups for whom being against the Jews plays a very important function. And when you begin to have that, that's when anti-Semitism arises, which I call the organization of politics against the Jews.
How do the Jews participate in the organization of politics against themselves?
Well, they don't participate in it. So
but how do they allow for it?
Well, it's not that they allow for it. It's that the world is made up of people who are not like them. The world is not made up of people like them. So the mistake is, and it's very much the same as America. You can be the best people in the world, but if others are not like you, then you cannot work on the premise that everybody is going to behave the way you behave. And once they begin to behave badly towards you, even when you begin to feel the first signs of it, you have got to devote at least as much energy and resources to fighting them off as you do to building yourself up.
This is how you write it in the book. Jews were innocent of all they were accused of, but by attending to self-improvement without commensurate care for self-protection, they had created a political vacuum and for others a political opportunity. The Jewish combination of prowess and powerlessness worked as predictably in politics as do the laws of solubility in chemistry. It's an amazing line. For those Jews who don't want to remain the no-fail target, what do you recommend that they do? How should they change?
You do not ignore. You do not ignore that evil, and you do not pretend that it is other than it is, and you don't try to pacify it, and you don't try to appease it. You know that if it is, and if it has isolated you, and if it's organized against you, like it or not, you have got to defend effectively enough to go on the offensive. We are talking now at a time when who is teaching us this? Of all places in the world, Ukraine? I mean, Israel has been teaching this to the world forever, and how much it takes out of Israelis, I don't have to tell you. If that's why it's so difficult to be an Israeli. It's not just a parent, but can you imagine the parent that knows that is going to have to do this as a grandparent and as a great-grandparent?
Send your child to war.
Now the question is, how do you change them? Part of it is by showing your own strength, inner strength, yes, your own conviction, not chest thumping, not that with the fists, no, but just, moral self-confidence. But the second step is to defeat them.
I want to go back, if we could, to the field of Yiddish and what's happened to it. Because many of the people that I know who are rising stars in the field of Yiddish or starting Yiddish journals are not Zionists.
I know.
They're anti-Zionists, or as they might say, post-Zionists. And to be super crude about it, they would basically say that Hebrew is kind of the language of Jewish power, and Yiddish is the language of Jewish powerlessness, and therefore it is a pure Jewish language. I imagine some of these people were your students even.
Yes, some of them were.
When did this start to shift, and how do you understand
it's not a
it?
shift. No, this is not a shift. This goes back a long time. Don't forget that one of the things you do when you are a target is you try to stop being a target.
That's
so
right.
We've been talking about the strategy of fighting back. But there was always another possibility or a set of possibilities. You could always get out. You get out of the Jewish people. Now, from a Jewish point of view, you're a Jew, born a Jew, you stay a Jew. It's not true. You could always convert to Christianity. And let me just say that when the going got tough in the 19th century, tens of thousands of Jews converted. For every kind of reason, they converted. So you could convert then. Socialism comes along, and it says, hey, you don't have to convert. All you have to do is to transcend. Judaism is really an unfinished road. What it really results in is socialism, is the internationalization or the universalization of Judaism. The same way as Christianity said in its time, socialism says in its time. It's the universalization of Judaism in some secular form. Well, Yiddish in the Soviet Union was allowed. The Soviet Union did this. It actually created this model. It said, it knew that national ethnicities existed. What was it going to do with them? So it outlawed Hebrew. It outlawed Zionism. It persecuted those who practiced their religion and who studied Hebrew or any of that. It actually persecuted them and then killed many of them. But Yiddish, it said, Yiddish is wonderful because it's the language of the proletariat. And so as long as Yiddish could prove itself to be, or it showed itself to be really on the side of the poor and the powerless and the disadvantaged, and let all the Bolshevik leaders get all that power and use it against them, right? Oh, they said how sweet this is and how wonderful it is. And many of them participated in it. And by the way, one of the things which I don't pursue is the fact that Jews don't hold themselves accountable. I would say, and you will have to see whether you think that this should be said, because it is very delicate, because we are blamed for things that we don't do. So we should certainly, know that we will be blamed, even if this is misunderstood. But Jews participated in communist terror. I mean, they really did. So why don't we look back, if we ask others to look back on the crimes that they committed, why aren't we obsessed with the crimes that were committed by Jews in the name of communism? Never in the name of Judaism, you understand. Then we don't commit crimes. But in the name of communism, we were susceptible to that. So that's where that began, that association of Yiddish with, as it were, powerlessness. But it was always a lie, because that is not the definition of Yiddish. Because Yiddish, as I say, was the instrument of Zionism. And it was the instrument of everything good and bad in Jewish life. It was the instrument of everything. It was the language. Because it was the language of those who were murdered, therefore it should now be conscripted to some kind of leftist ideology which wants to use that as its flag. I think that is extremely wrong.
A few weeks ago now, feels like a few years, but time moves so quickly, the Harvard Crimson endorsed BDS, the Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions movement against Israel. And this, of course, was the culmination of a movement that I think a lot of Jewish organizations patted themselves on the back. Oh, the schools aren't adopting BDS, so who cares? But as you and I both know, the real goal of the BDS movement is not to get a university to withdraw their investment in Caterpillar or Sabra Hummus or whatever it is. It's to make Jews the outliers on college campuses. And in that, it has been extraordinarily successful. My question is not really here about Harvard per se, or Yale or Columbia, or any particular editorial, because every school has gone through something like this. Mm-hmm. It's about the deeper question about how you think American Jews should be thinking about their relationships to these prestigious elite institutions that A, have shaped many of us, and B, that we've long aspired to be a part of. There is a formidable and growing movement inside the American Jewish community that says, time to get out. Mm-hmm. Leah Leibowitz wrote a piece, Get Out. Mm-hmm. Time to withdraw our support from these places. Mm-hmm. And there are others that say, no, that's giving up. The right thing to do is to reinvest, is to put up 10 walls in response to theirs, is to reform and not give up on these institutions, because to give up would mean that we've already lost. Where do you fall in that debate?
Well, I'm not trying to evade the question at all. I think it is one of the questions of the moment, but I would say that our good fortune is that there are a great many schools and a great many possibilities. One way is to create a new university, which again I point to you. That's one way to do it. You don't get out of the university business, you just create a better product, and you hope that the better product is then slowly going to reinforce the others. The other ways are through the world of ideas. You call out those universities, not for BDS. The BDS is just the manifestation of what we were describing, and that is where the schools went wrong. The schools abandoned the main principles of this country. The universities were supposed to reinforce the foundations of American democracy, because democracy is very difficult, and it is not biologically transmitted. And it's the role of the universities above all others at that higher level to show why this is such a precious system, how precarious it is in all its, in all its subtleties, right? Instead of doing that, it capitulated completely. It capitulated ideologically, and it hired a great many people, by the way, not only who don't teach that, but who dislike America.
Are you bearish or bullish on the future of the American Jewish community? We were talking just before we sat down here about a recent visit you had to a doctor. And, well, actually, maybe you could tell it.
I had a real shock. I'm surprised at myself at being shocked, but I was. When a very nice person that I know, one of the most measured people I know, said that he was moving to Israel, which made a lot of sense because his children and grandchildren are already there. But then speaking about the children said, yes, my daughter was the first to see the handwriting on the wall. I couldn't understand what this meant. And he said, yes, I know, you are a believer in America. But the Jews have been kicked out of every place, have been made to feel unwelcome in every place that they've lived in. I was stunned. I said, surely you're not saying that it's time to leave America, that the Jews are now at a point like the French Jews who think it's time to... He said, I'm surprised by your surprise. And what can I tell you? It has made me rethink how a certain sector of American Jewry feels. I do not want to believe that. Why? Because I think America is worth fighting for. I think, of course, it's not a question of either or, but the world needs this country, and this country needs this country. So it's not the universities, I would say. When we focus too narrowly on the universities, we are making a strategic mistake. It is the whole cultural world that sustains those universities. It is the world of the media, but it's also those people have been produced by the universities. So it goes in a cyclical thing. We have to really bring back the notion of how precious things are, and that if you do not preserve what is good, you are drawn to what is evil. You become what is evil, especially when evil is afoot. Bad ideas drive out the good. That we have learned. Who would have known? They say bad money drives out the good. But who knew that bad ideas could drive out the good?
What is at stake in Jews staying here and making the fight here?
What is at stake? That's a good question. America is at stake. And I think we owe it to this country. Do we owe anything to this country as citizens and as people whom it rescued at a certain point and whom it supported? Do we believe that America is a wonderful country and a huge force for good in the world that it can be, and that it's still looked to by millions of people and by many countries as being the only possible policeman in the world? Do we believe that? Well, those of us who do believe it, whatever particular policy we may favor at a certain point, nevertheless, we have to fight for this country's good. I mean, we can't say, you know, goodbye and good luck and go off to some other place. That other place depends on this place. So I think what we do here is of enormous importance.
Ruth Wisse, a total honor. You might not be able to name your hero or who you admire easily, but I certainly can because she's sitting right in front of me.
Oh, Bari, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, love. Thank you.